The Second World War was the deadliest war the world has seen to this day. Over 60 million people lost their lives, and these were not the soldiers that fought on the front lines. A huge portion of them have been innocent civilians. However, today we want to switch our focus to what happened in Asia. From 1932 to the war's end in 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army committed unimaginable war crimes in South Asia. Especially women were the target of the Japanese Army. And their suffering is a horrifying chapter, which is so-called comfort stations, where they then lived in unimaginable conditions and were subject to physical violence, psychological trauma, and repeated abuse. Welcome to Past Perspectives, and today we want to shed light on a topic that is barely being talked about: the horrifying things the Japanese did to women during the Second World War. Now, the tragedy of these women is not just a story of wartime brutality. It's a story of systematic, gender-based violence and the erasure of women's dignity and humanity. And it's a story that, despite efforts, has yet to see full acknowledgement, justice, or reparation. Now, before we dive in, I want to say that we are not making this video to sensationalize what happened, but to educate and raise awareness about this deeply troubling aspect of history that is not getting the attention it needs. Also, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you can learn about all the history topics you've never even heard about in school. With that being said, let's dive in. In early 1930, Japan began with their military expansion in Asia, and the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 marked the start of Japanese efforts to expand their influence in Asia. In the following years, Japan brought havoc among the continent and started a full-scale war with China in 1937. Where they were able to capture major cities like Beijing or Shanghai. After their early successes, the Japanese expanded their efforts to French Indochina in 1940, which today is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And even though the atrocities against women already started in the early 1930s as the Imperial Japanese Army started capturing thousands of women against their will, the Japanese called them comfort women, which is an euphemistic expression that refers to women that have been forced into slavery by the Japanese Army during the Second World War. It's a term that in many ways masks the brutal reality these women really had to face. They were not quote-unquote comforting by choice. They were forced, deceived, or abducted into serving into the so-called comfort stations. Now, the term comfort station is another term that is used to describe the places where these women were held. As you can imagine, these were also not stations of comfort, but places where these women have been held hostage and were subject to immense suffering. They were confined in dirty conditions, often in improvised barracks or half-destroyed buildings. They had little to no freedom, were often beaten, and lived in the constant fear of abuse by soldiers. In a lot of accounts, their conditions are compared to the concentration camps at that time. However, they served a different purpose. The majority of these women came from Korea, China, and the Philippines, which all were countries that have been under Japanese occupation or were in close distance to the war front. However, it's important to note that women from other countries like Indonesia, these comfort stations have been organized by the Japanese government at that time, and the reasons behind them were extremely shallow, as everybody, including the Japanese government, knew what was happening there. According to Japanese military documents and statements from that time, there were two primary reasons given. The first one was the prevention of sexual violence by soldiers, and the second one was the control of sexually transmitted diseases. On the surface, these reasons might seem like an attempt to maintain order and discipline among the troops. However, as I said earlier, when you dig deeper, the flaws and moral shortcomings become extremely obvious. Firstly, the idea that forcing women into comfort stations could somehow prevent violence is not just paradoxical. It's deeply flawed and inhumane. I mean, the act of capturing women, abducting them, and forcing them into comfort stations is already a form of violence. To me and most historians, it seems like these documents seem to be some kind of cover-up to the real atrocities that happened there. I mean, your logic can't be that twisted to claim that you prevent violence by establishing comfort stations. The second argument about controlling STDs is equally problematic. While it's true that militaries throughout history have been concerned about the spread of diseases, using this as a justification for slavery is morally imps. The scale of the comfort stations is almost incomprehensible, as there are no exact numbers on how many women were forced into slavery. The stigma of being a comfort woman and the deeply rooted belief in honor in Asian countries prevented a lot of survivors from coming forward. However, conservative estimates at that time suggest that at least 20,000 women were forced into this system. Now, according to new studies and survivor testimonies indicate that the numbers were as high as 400,000. As I mentioned earlier, often countries like Korea, China, and the Philippines are believed to be the main victims. But the reality is that these stations were set up wherever the Imperial Japanese Army went, which means that this also includes regions like Indonesia and the Pacific Islands. This means that not only Asian women were forced into these comfort stations, but also at that time, an Australian nurse is captured in Singapore, are among those who were captured. And while the war may have ended in 1945, the survivors of these atrocities suffered even years afterwards, as the comfort stations didn't get closed down from one day to the other. And even after these stations were closed, the battle for acknowledgement and justice has been extremely long. For decades, the Japanese government denied any involvement in the comfort women system, and they even had the audacity to claim that these women have been there voluntarily. The denial of their entire existence added another layer of suffering to the survivors, as they not only denied their experiences, but also made it even harder for them to admit what happened to them, as they not only had the fear of losing their honor, but it also gave them the fear that nobody would believe them. It took almost 50 years until the Japanese government officially acknowledged the existence of the comfort stations in 1993. This acknowledgement came in the form of the Kono Statement, named after then Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono. And while the statement was a step in the right direction, it fell short of offering reparations and even an official apology. What makes this even worse is that other Japanese politicians even questioned its validity and demanded, and the issue still puts a diplomatic stain between Japan and the countries from which these women were taken, particularly South Korea and China. While there have been some attempts at reparations, such as the Asian Women's Fund and a 2015 agreement between Japan and South Korea, have been met with criticism for not going far enough or for lacking the input and approval of the survivors themselves. And even if there has been some kind of reparations offered, this doesn't change the physical and psychological aftermath these women had to suffer. And even more importantly, most of the victims wouldn't have gotten anything out of it as it was 50 years later. And even the end of the comfort system wasn't the end of their nightmare. Many survivors have reported experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and severe anxiety, which made it hard for women to be reintegrated into society and live normal lives. Returning home was also far from a release for these women. In many cases, they were met with social exclusion and shame, rather than support and understanding. This also made it impossible for many women to marry or even rejoin their families. Therefore, many of them chose to live in seclusion. The entire aftermath created a cycle of suffering that persisted for generations, and is a grim reminder that atrocities during the Second World War are not limited to the European continent. As we close this video, let's ensure that there's